Appreciated. And as you may have read in the schedule, because that I believe is the reason for your attendance here, we are going to talk about how do governments interact with the tech sector in the Bay Area. My name is Teresa Horisova. I'm the Director for Project Development at Diplo Foundation, working extensively also on the Geneva Internet Platform project. And I was honored to be one of the co-authors of a study that you can find on your desks, hopefully. Otherwise, there are more copies somewhere around, and that is also for free download online on the Bay Area Techplomacy. So what we would like to do now is to kind of try to discuss with you and share some of our experience from the study that we did, trying to map how do actually countries interact with the tech sector. It was inspired by our recent visit in San Francisco, actually for an event organized by Joya from Swissnex. I will introduce Joya properly in a minute. And we kind of were really inspired by the model how Switzerland is being represented in the Bay Area. And then we try to look at some other countries, and we realize that there are many countries that do it in a totally different way, that the countries, when you look at them, do it from various motivations. We have also realized there are countries that don't know how to interact with the tech sector at all. And we thought this was a worthwhile kind of exercise to look into it a bit more, because we expected at the beginning that by being, kind of having diplomatic representation at the center of innovation, where all the tech developments that sooner or later will become policy are happening, that this is the place for the governments, because of course governments have their stakes in following what is happening in terms of technological innovation. At the same time, the tech sector as well has their stakes on having a good relationship with the government. So we kind of expected, let's look into it and let's see how this has changed the diplomacy, the conventional diplomacy we know from other areas. So it resulted in the study that you have on your desks. And I would first like to ask my colleague, Pavlina Itilson from Diplo, who is a researcher with us and who is one of the co-authors, to kind of tell us in a few words, what did we do, what did we find out, what are some of the basic models, and what were maybe some of the surprises that we realized in this research. Just to mention, the third author of the study is not present here. It is the director of Diplo, Jovan Kurbalia, and he's the kind of conceptual mind behind all this, so it wouldn't be fair for the two of us to take the credit, because the real brain behind that is Jovan. Over to you, Pavlina.
Thank you, Teresa. So my name is Pavlina Itilson, and I worked on this project talking to the consulates in the San Francisco Bay Area as well as in Washington, D.C. Just to frame the report, when you look at it, a little bit of background to see where we're coming from. So we are independent and neutral nonprofit. So this report was designed to be a practical look about how things work in the Bay Area. It was not meant to take a side. It was not meant to be a qualitative exercise of who's doing it better, who's doing it worse, but it was a look from outside. And it serves as a guide for countries who do not have representation in the Bay Area, especially small countries and developing countries who would like to start doing something, to see what is out there. So in the course of this research, we interviewed more than 30 countries. And as Teresa said, our expectations were to see how the conversation is framed between the tech companies and the countries within the San Francisco Bay Area, and find policy-making mechanisms between consulates and the tech companies. What our main findings were a little bit different from what we expected. First, all the countries we spoke to, everybody said they need to engage with the tech companies in the Bay Area in order to protect their interests, the interest of their citizens, and the rights of their citizens. It did not matter whether that country was rich or poor, small or big, where it was geographically, all of them said the same thing. The other thing they said also warned us about the dress code in the Bay Area when we come visit. Not to wear a tie and dressed down. But we found out that certain countries are sticking to the traditional approaches of dealing with the tech companies in the Bay Area through their economic sections, either of the DC embassy or at the consulates. A lot of them do traditional way of honorary consuls, but there are certain new ways of doing things, and those were two. That is, one is the exceptional Denmark example of having a separate tech diplomat with a global mandate who basically only works on policy making. His economic side, the side of trade investment goes aside, the political issues are also handled by someone else. He is his name is Kasper Klinge, but he is the meeting point between the Danish government and the policies they would like to shape and implement for the future, and the tech companies, but not only in Silicon Valley, of course, but also in China and everywhere else in the world. The other one, of which we have two representatives here, are the innovation centers, which are either attached to consulate of the country or are separate, legally and otherwise, and who work with the tech companies on promoting startups, on implementing their values through these innovation centers. So we have clearly established a trend that the size, the influence, and the policy impact of the big tech companies influences the practice of traditional diplomacy in a way that due to the power of the tech companies, due to the impact they are able to achieve, and their economic strength, they are on par for a lot of countries to nation states. And some countries already starting to deal with these tech companies on the level of nation states. I mean, there are of course certain issues arising out of this which we didn't delve into in our report, but which probably will be discussed by other speakers here. But that is our main finding, and that seems to be the way the diplomacy is changing in the Bay Area and globally. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Pavlina. You know, I think what you also gathered is that we are kind of brave enough to admit that the original hypothesis we had was not confirmed at all, which rarely happens in research papers. But we really expected to see, okay, that's the motivation for the countries to be represented, but unlike a few examples like we will hear from Joya and Martin, still primarily the main incentive for countries to be present in the Bay Area is because of economic reasons, like for investment, and that is kind of counterintuitive when you realize that the policy centers, then discussing those policy aspects, are somewhere else. It's in Brussels, it's in DC. So what, in our view, like indirectly also came up during the research clearly was that there are some problems in the coordination mechanisms. There are some problems in the kind of efficiency of the representation, because it might not make sense that, let's say, you do policy through embassy in DC, but kind of the same public money finances somebody taking care of investments in the Bay Area. Of course, I'm simplifying, and it's more complicated than this. But this clearly showed. From the kind of mapping and research and theory that Pavlina has hinted, I would now like to look at some practical examples. And we have with us Joya Leitner from SwissNext, which is a model that really, I would say, served as a role model for many countries that we have talked to. One of our kind of standard questions in the interviews was, is there a country that is an inspiration for you, that is a role model? And many countries have indeed mentioned Switzerland, maybe even more than Denmark would be expected would be the case, because of the kind of visibility of the Danish model and the media coverage and everything. So Joya, would you be so kind and tell us something more about what are the motivations for Switzerland? What makes the Swiss model unique? And how do you go about it in the Bay Area? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I actually have a question first to the room. I would like to know if there's any diplomats. Oh, no, okay. Halfway, and maybe public officials, government employees. Okay.
And business sector, the tech sector? Private.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. No, the reason I'm asking is I think we have one diplomat, actual, and a former diplomat here as well, and I'm actually not a diplomat at all, and I'm sometimes proud to say it. But that's also a little bit because of a backward view on things that should change looking into the future. So I'll tell you a bit more about Swissnex. Swissnex is actually a network of 5 offices around the world that really was established with the mission to connect Switzerland's innovation ecosystem in the very broad sense, ranging from research, education, all the way to startups and corporations, innovation departments, with the most important hubs of innovation around the world. So our first office was in the Boston-Cambridge area, second office was San Francisco 15 years ago, and we have, in the meantime, we have opened offices in Shanghai, Bangalore, and Brazil. And it's very much a bottom-up initiative, and it's very much a public-private partnership in that only 1/3 of our funding actually comes from the government, and 2/3 we have to basically find through projects, and every Swissnex has to interpret and leverage the context they're in based on whatever they can offer from that context back to Switzerland and someone's willing to pay for. And in this sense, our customer or clients, it's hard word to use in the public sector because we're still public sector. We're for a long time not allowed to use the word customers or clients, but de facto it's paying partners. They are everything from universities to startups to actual large corporations or even civil society organizations or public representations like other offices of the government, federal government or cantonal government or municipal governments that are seeking some kind of foresight, innovation, insights or connections in the areas where we are present. And as you can imagine, Bay Area, of course, is probably the most magnetic of innovation hubs in the world today. I don't want to say that necessarily means that it's the most performant or the most interesting, but it's the most magnetic still today. So we are by far the biggest office. We have 21 employees and we have 75 workspaces in our space. So we actually host in our space everything from artists. This is a little bit specific to San Francisco. We actually are also the Arts Council representation abroad. So we actually work on arts and tech projects. We have journalists and media representatives in our space. We have startups, we have corporates, and academia. So everyone together under one roof. And it's a really interesting little innovation ecosystem that represents Switzerland to some extent, but not necessarily so much focused on itself, because we actually have a lot of people who are local but have some sort of connection with Switzerland. So this it's pretty unique, but it's very much a representation, and I think in the end that's going to guide every reflection any country will have about this. It reflects your country's political culture. And Switzerland is a deeply bottom-up political culture, which is why a model like this actually works and might not work for other countries. And the Swissnex was one of the very first models like this out there. We were studied by other countries, copied by other countries, and I think there were a lot of sort of interesting counterexamples, other examples, but none of them, absolutely none of them work like we do. And none of them work like the others do, because they're all representations of the political culture back home, and the level of freedom they're given, the level of bottom-up decision-making they're given, the level of entrepreneurial thinking they're given really depends on how willing a government is to, I would say, experiment and let these institutions make decisions, act on foresight the way that they think is relevant and necessary, rather than being given instructions. We get zero instructions from our government. We're not given policy agendas, we're not given thematic agendas, we're absolutely not given anything other than some parameters within which we have to do our work from a structural, procedural point of view. But we are, in terms of topics, completely free to interpret our mission. So that's very Swiss, I would say.
It's very Swiss, and in a way it's not really conventional diplomacy, because your hands are not tied. It's not the traditional way of doing diplomacy by having almost everything cleared from the capital, which I'm sure that Bertrand can then elaborate on later. So thank you very much. Clearly this is a model to look up at, and also when we met the basic models in the study, by no means was our motivation to say, okay, take it, replicate. no, everything would need to be adjusted not only to the political culture but to many other factors, starting from financial, ending with really what the main objectives of the representations are. Because, let's say, for some certain types of motivations for being represented in the Bay Area, this model might not be useful at all. Coming to Martin Rauchbauer, who is Director of Open Austria, the Innovation Center, as Pavlina said, and at the same time the Consul General of Austria in San Francisco. So in your double role, it would be also interesting for us to hear about the Austrian experience and motivations. Thank you, Martin.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I also want to just say a word of thanks to the DIPLO Foundation and their study, because I think it led to a lot of countries to a moment of reflection on what they were actually doing. And has been very, very helpful in galvanizing us, and also led to a certain increase in level of collaboration between the countries. SwissNext, you said, was a model for many countries, and I confess it was a model for us as well. When we came to the Bay Area in 2016, SwissNext was so kind. When I say we, it was just actually me, but it was all by myself, and SwissNext was so kind to provide me a desk at SwissNext, and I was sitting there together with other Swiss startups, and I never forget the day when there was an American visitor to SwissNext, and he asked me whether Open Austria was a Swiss startup. After a while, we felt it was wise to look for another space, and we, in the meantime, hosted in a co-working space. We're now 7 members, and our mission was, again, at the beginning, very different from what it is now. So, Open Austria was an initiative really driven by the Austrian startup and innovation scene at the beginning. In 2015, we had I think the youngest foreign minister of the world, who's now become the youngest prime minister in the world. So a person very well rooted. He always proud to call himself a digital native, very well rooted in the startup scene. And he made a trip to Silicon Valley with startups, Austrian startups, met with successful Austrian entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and there declared to the press that also came along that we're going to do something. And then the foreign ministry was under pressure, and there was actually a huge debate of why the foreign ministry, what should we do there? This is really different from a traditional diplomatic approach. And then after a while, I was part of that effort, and it was really very interesting and a lot of fun to really shape that idea. And then we branded it, and then the Austrian Trade Commission came on board. And at the beginning, we really were focused on startups. We still are. We have a startup accelerator program with about 10 to 15 Austrian startups that we host and that we place and work together with local partners. But increasingly, in these one and a half years that we're now present, it became clear that there is a demand from various other sectors of Austrian society and public administration and even politics. So we have, like many other countries, about at least one politician per month, and we can really categorize them in 2 ways. Some politicians come to the Bay Area and they're there for the photo op. Yeah? They want to have a picture taken in front of the Facebook wall because it signals to their constituencies that they're very innovative and startup-y. But there are other politicians who simply are interested in opening channels of communication to the tech industry, particularly to the social media. But there are other issues that come up, and where even though the tech giants in particular have representatives either in Europe or even in Austria, the dialogue is a very different one since we are present there locally, have simply a different level of contacts there, and therefore the conversation has managed to get a different degree. So that was one reason, demand from public administration. Demand also from other actors in the innovation scenes. The Austrian industry increasingly comes to us and asks for our help in getting the innovation challenge right. That's also a part. Austria is, like Switzerland, a country with a large artistic tradition, and we have a lot of artists and creative people coming to the city. So that is part of our mandate too. But there's another reason why we have made slowly in those 1.5 years a pivot towards policy as well, and that is the fact Austria is a member of the European Union. In fact, in a few months we will have the presidency of the European Union. And the European Union is, interestingly enough, not present in Silicon Valley, although it's very present through its regulations, as we all know, and it's been one of the hot topics of RightsCon. And so sometimes the EU countries get into the role of explaining EU regulations and being, in some ways, in this position of this mixed blessing curse. You know, Silicon Valley is very often about self-regulation and no government at all. This is changing, interestingly enough. We had the feeling that GDPR is actually increasingly seen as a good thing. At least it sets clear standards for the world, and we are all in this mix. To put it short in one sentence, we started as a government-sponsored diplomatic effort of helping startups, and we ended up back at traditional diplomacy, which I think is in a very relatively short amount of time.
But thank you, Martin, for also sharing this evolution. Yes, because that's being at an area where things go so fast, change so fast, develop so fast. It's great to see an example of a country that gets adjusted. So thank you very much for your reflections. Now, turning to Bertrand de la Chapelle, who is not only the executive director and co-founder of the Internet and Jurisdiction project, but also a former French thematic ambassador covering cyber issues. So you have, in a way, been part of a diplomacy experiment, you know, being more involved in cyber in particular, and you're very aware of the issues that we are discussing here. So does conventional diplomacy work in a setting like that? What are the challenges, and how does the tech sector and the private companies come in play? Thank you, Bertrand.
Well, thanks for inviting me to join this this panel. Although I've never been positioned in Silicon Valley or so, I want to share a little bit of the evolution of the general theme of the relationship between states and companies. And I would actually take as a hook the very last words that you used, which is we move back to traditional diplomacy.